Winter had stolen almost everything from Arthur: his wife, his youth, his easy laughter. But one morning, he found a trembling bobcat kitten in the snow. So he brought it inside, and Lucy, his old cat, gently tucked the wild orphan beneath her chin, turning a lonely cabin into a home filled with warmth once more. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. And if this moment warms your heart, like and subscribe for more stories of love, healing, and second chances. Snow had been falling since before dawn, a quiet, stubborn curtain that made the pines bow their dark heads and turned the dirt road to Arthur's cabin into a white hush. At 71, Arthur measured storms the way some folks measured years, by how they made the roof sing and the stove earn its keep. He shuffled to the door with his mug, the steam curling between his fingers, and paused when he heard it again. A small, broken sound from under the porch, thin as a thread yet sharp enough to snag his chest. He set the mug on the sill and stepped into the cold. The world outside felt made of paper and breath. Arthur leaned, knees cracking, and lifted the corner lattice. 2 gold marbles blinked back at him from a nest of thawing needles and gray slush. A kitten. No, not a house cat. Not with that tufted face and spots like spilled coffee along its flank. A bobcat, barely the length of his forearm, shivering so hard its ribs trembled like plucked strings. "Easy there," Arthur murmured. He'd spoken in that same tone to a woman once, a lifetime ago when she'd woken from surgery afraid of the tubes. He slid his hands beneath the tiny body. It was cold through and through, as if the snow had seeped into its bones. The kitten's breath stuttered against his palms, its paws, wide and soft, curled reflexively around his wrist. "All right, you got me," he said, and the words came out like a promise he hadn't planned to make. Inside, the cabin smelled of cedar and coffee, and the faint, comforting musk of old cat fur. Lucy lay curled on the braided rug by the wood stove, her chin tucked into her paws, ears like folded leaves. She was 14 now, a small queen who had outlived Arthur's wife and the noisy years of grief that followed. When the door thumped shut behind him, Lucy's head came up, not startled, just awake to the change. Arthur eased the bobcat onto a towel and knelt beside the stove, rubbing its fur with slow, steady strokes. A soft, ragged sound, almost a chirp, slipped from the kitten's throat. "Don't get attached," he told himself, even as he fussed with the towel to build a little nest. Wild is wild. He scanned the face, stubby tail, black bars along the legs, faint eyeliner sweeping from the corners of those impossible eyes. "Your trouble," he added. But the words didn't bite. They landed like a smile he'd forgotten how to wear. Lucy stood, stretched, and crossed the room with the unhurried dignity of someone who knows where every floorboard creaks. Her whiskers flared. She sniffed the air once, twice, then approached the towel bundle. Arthur held his breath. He knew cats, knew the warning flick of a tail, the prickly arc of a back. But Lucy did none of that. She sat, close but not crowding, and lowered her head until her nose touched the bobcat's ear. The kitten, on pure reflex, butted clumsily into her cheek. Arthur exhaled, too loud. "Huh." Lucy began to groom the little stranger as if she were resuming a familiar task. Small, precise licks. The bobcat let out a fluttering, uncertain purr, like a failing engine that wants to catch. Arthur fed a few more splits to the stove and filled a bowl with warm water, adding a drop of honey the way his grandmother once had when the winter calves were weak. He offered it by teaspoon, and the kitten latched on, tongue rasping, eyes half closed. "Guess you're not giving up," he said, and something inside him answered, "Me neither." He waited for the fear to arrive, a flood of sense, the voice that says this is foolish. The word bobcat should have sounded like a slammed door, but the cabin held only the crackle of heat and the soft, rhythmic sound of Lucy's tongue. The world outside could keep its rules for a while. Inside, among the framed photos of trailheads and the quilt his wife had made from old shirts, warmth had drawn its own circle. When the kitten finished the last sweet sip, it sagged. Lucy shifted, tucking her body around the smaller shape. Imperfect, maternal, resolute. Arthur eased another towel over them both, the way he used to tuck the crocheted throw around his wife's knees in her final winter. He was surprised by the steadiness of his hands. He was surprised, too, by the strange brightness behind his ribs. It felt like a lamp had turned on in a room he'd been living in the dark. "You need a name," he said after a while, "because names are how people anchor things they're afraid to lose." He watched the snow thread past the window, watched Lucy keep her vigil. A twig ticked against the glass like a quiet metronome. Willow, he decided, for bending without breaking. Willow didn't wake when he said it, but Lucy's ear twitched, as if to agree or to remind him she would have final say in all household matters. Arthur chuckled, a sound that startled him with its own youth. Day wore on in small tasks. He warmed milk, then water again. He held Willow's paws in his palm to thaw the pads and tested for any swelling or sharp pain. Nothing broken, just hunger, cold, and whatever fear gets knotted in the body when the world is new and the mother is gone. He patted a box and set it near the stove, not too close, with an old wool scarf for weight and scent. Lucy abandoned it twice, returning to the rug. The third time, she climbed into the box, as if to demonstrate the correct usage. Willow wriggled until her head fit under Lucy's chin. Arthur stood by the window and watched the tree line through the lightly frosted glass. Once a red shape slid between the trunks. A fox, quick as a thought. It paused, nose lifted. The wind shifted, and the fox melted back into the white. Somewhere beyond those pines lay the life that would one day call to Willow, with a voice he wouldn't be able to imitate or ignore. He braced himself against that knowledge, then let it go. Today was enough. By late afternoon, the storm thinned to a fine, floating dust. A plow grumbled in the distance, and the phone rang. Neighbor, checking in, passing along the kind of news that never quite matters, but keeps people threaded to one another. "Still got power? Still got soup?" Arthur answered yes, and did not mention the other truth, that there was a wild thing sleeping in his living room, and an old cat keeping guard like a weary saint. After he hung up, he sat on the floor with his back against the sofa and watched them breathe. Lucy's steady rise and fall, Willow's quick, bird-like flutter. He felt the quiet settle around him, not empty but full, like the second before a choir begins. He understood, dimly, that he had stepped through a door that morning, and that doors often lead to other doors. Maybe the town would talk when they found out. Maybe they'd be right to worry. Maybe he would, too. But the small circle of now held. Outside, a branch thumped somewhere deep in the woods. Willow startled in her sleep, then reached. A blind, instinctive gesture, and Lucy's paw landed on her tiny spine. Stay. Breathe. Hush. Arthur smiled. Okay then. He whispered to the room, to the snow, to the soft beating hearts. We'll figure it out. And if, just for a second, he pictured the road into town, heads turning, whispers starting, a question he didn't yet know how to answer. That was a worry for a different day. Evening had its own work. To keep the fire fed, to heat the kettle, to watch hope make itself at home. Morning broke with a hard crust of ice on the window panes, each breath fogging the glass as Arthur leaned close. The storm had left the world sharp and brittle, every branch outlined in white. He turned back to the living room and froze, not because anything was wrong, but because everything was impossibly right. Lucy still curled in the box, Mom, but Willow had climbed halfway onto her back during the night, a striped bundle nestled like she'd always belonged. Arthur stood for a moment, afraid to disturb the scene. He hadn't seen peace like that in years, maybe decades. He brewed coffee, careful with the clink of the pot, but the smell was enough. Willow stirred, eyes blinking open, ears twitching at the strange hiss of the kettle. She rose unsteadily, and Arthur realized with a jolt that her little legs carried a hunter's stance, knees bent, steps soundless, gaze sharp. Even weak, she moved like something older than her days. "You're not just a house guest, are you?" he muttered. Lucy flicked her tail in Arthur's direction, a warning or perhaps a reminder. "She's under my watch, not yours." That afternoon, Arthur bundled up and stepped into the snow, shovel scraping, the wind cutting through his coat. His neighbor, Bill, trudged over from the property line. "Heard a noise last night," Bill said, stamping his boots. "Like a cat crying. You still got Lucy?" Arthur's throat tightened. He nodded. "She's fine." Bill narrowed his eyes. "Coyote's been close lately. Careful with doors open." He tipped his cap and crunched back toward the tree line, but Arthur could feel suspicion hanging in the air, like frost that refused to melt. When he returned inside, Willow was crouched by the hearth, tail twitching at the shadows. Lucy sat nearby, perfectly still, her kind of approval. Arthur closed the door harder than he meant to. That night, the first test came. A yowl outside, long, mournful, echoing against the ridge. Willow bolted upright, tiny muscles coiled. She pressed to the door, nose working. Arthur's gut twisted. Is it her mother? Another bobcat? Or something waiting to finish what winter started? He knelt, blocking her path. "Not tonight, kid," he whispered, hand hovering an inch from her back. Willow hissed softly, a wild sound that rattled the quiet cabin. Lucy leapt down, wedging herself between them, and swatted Willow once, light, decisive. The kitten froze, ears flattening. Arthur sat back, heart pounding harder than it should. Outside, the cry faded. Inside, Willow sank down, trembling, until Lucy curled against her again. Arthur stared into the fire, the question gnawing at him. How long before someone else hears that cry and comes looking? And when they do, what will they see? A rescued stray, or a wild creature that doesn't belong under a man's roof? He sipped his coffee gone cold, eyes heavy. And for the first time since his wife's passing, Arthur wondered if he'd taken on more than he could carry. But then Willow shifted in her sleep, pressing closer to Lucy's warmth, and he felt the faintest flicker of something stubborn, like a candle refusing to die in a draft. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow, he'd figure it out. Tonight, the cabin was still theirs. The following morning, Arthur woke to the sound of claws on wood. At first, he thought Lucy had found some mischief, but when he shuffled into the living room, he found Willow perched on the windowsill, her small body rigid, ears pinned forward. Outside, fresh tracks dotted the snow, bigger than any house cat, smaller than a wolf. Bobcat tracks. Arthur's stomach tightened. He knew what that meant. The wild wasn't done with her. He coaxed Willow down with a strip of leftover bacon. She leapt to the rug, eyes still darting toward the door. Lucy padded over, brushing her tail across Willow's flank as if to ground her. Watching them, Arthur felt a pang of both wonder and dread. He wasn't sheltering just one cat anymore. He was standing in the middle of something larger, a line between the wild and the hearth. By noon, a new problem arrived. A knock rattled the door, sharp against the stillness. Arthur's heart lurched. Hardly anyone came unannounced this far up the ridge. When he opened the door, two figures stood against the snow. A wildlife officer in a thick parka, and Bill, the neighbor, hat pulled low. "Morning, Arthur," the officer said, scanning the porch with professional calm. "Your neighbor mentioned hearing animal cries near your place." Arthur felt Lucy wind around his ankles, a living lie detector. Willow, thank heaven, stayed out of sight, tucked in the box near the stove. He forced a steady tone. "Coyotes," he said. "Been close these nights." The officer studied him, then the cabin. "Mind if I step in? Always good to remind folks. Wildcats don't survive long in the cold without their mother. Sometimes people think they're rescuing, but..." He let the thought trail, heavy with implication. Arthur's chest tightened. He pictured Willow in the box, Lucy watching over her. To let them see her now could mean cages, relocation, maybe worse. He shook his head. "Best not. Stove's temperamental. Smoke everywhere." Bill frowned. "You sure nothing's tucked in there, Arthur? I've seen you take strays before." Arthur met his gaze, years of shared fence lines between them. Strays are one thing, wilds another. The officer nodded, not convinced, but not pushing. "Well, if you hear more cries, call us. Safer that way." When they left, Arthur shut the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. Behind him, a small sound broke the silence. Willow, creeping out, her golden eyes fixed on him. She tilted her head as though asking whether she'd done something wrong by simply existing. Arthur crouched low. "No one's taking you," he murmured, though doubt curled in his chest. Could he really keep her safe from neighbors, from officials, from the call of the woods itself? Lucy joined them, pressing close to Willow with a deliberate weight. In that moment, Arthur understood. He wasn't just choosing for himself anymore. The bond between his old queen and this wild orphan was sealed, undeniable. Whatever storm was coming, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Arthur felt the pulse of purpose quicken through his veins. Dangerous, maybe reckless, but alive. 2 days passed, each one colder than the last. The cabin creaked under the weight of ice, and Arthur found himself glancing at the tree line more often than usual. Tracks came and went in the snow. Bobcat prints. Maybe the mother searching. Maybe something else. Willow paced near the windows at night, ears pricked at every shadow. Lucy stayed close and sometimes pressing her body against Willow's to calm her trembling, sometimes fixing Arthur with a look that said, "You chose this path. Don't back out now." By the third evening, trouble found them again. Arthur trudged into town for supplies, flour, lamp oil, extra firewood delivery. He thought he was careful, but whispers trailed him through the general store. A woman by the canned goods asked Bill in a low voice, "Didn't you hear it? That wild thing near Arthur's place? Dangerous for pets." Bill only shrugged, but his silence was enough to seed suspicion. When Arthur returned home, his unease proved justified. Tire tracks cut fresh lines in the snow outside his gate. Someone had driven up while he was gone. He quickened his steps, groceries digging into his fingers, pulse hammering. Inside, Lucy sat stiff near the stove, tail lashing. Willow was nowhere in sight. Panic shot through Arthur until he spotted the box tipped on its side. Willow was wedged behind the woodpile, eyes wide, body trembling as if she'd seen a ghost. Arthur crouched, murmuring until Willow crawled out, pressing her tiny head against his sleeve. He stroked her fur, finding it damp from fright. Whoever had come, maybe kids, maybe curious neighbors, had scared her badly enough to make her hide. That night, as the fire snapped and hissed, Arthur poured a stiff cup of coffee and sat staring at the door. He realized how quickly the quiet of his life had changed. Just weeks ago, the cabin had been nothing but wood, silence, and Lucy's steady presence. Now there was heat of a different kind. Fear of discovery, the fragile trust of a wild heart beating under his roof, the sharp knowledge that the world beyond his porch wouldn't understand. Near midnight, Willow crept into his lap for the first time, her body light as breath. She tucked herself into the folds of his flannel shirt. Lucy leapt up onto the arm of the chair, eyes half closed, watching. Arthur's chest tightened with a mix of dread and gratitude. He whispered into the dark, "They'll come asking again. And when they do, what story do we tell?" The firelight flickered across Lucy's whiskers and Willow's spotted fur, as if the answer wasn't words at all, but the stubborn choice to keep them both safe, no matter what storm waited outside. The next morning broke bright and brittle, sunlight glaring off the ice like shards of glass. Arthur tried to welcome the quiet, but his gut stayed tight. He sensed the valley watching him, as if every branch carried whispers. Willow was stronger now, no longer a bundle of shivers. She darted across the rug with surprising grace, pouncing on the frayed tassel of Arthur's bootlace. Lucy tolerated the nonsense with queenly patience, swatting only when Willow's claws got too bold. For a moment, Arthur let himself laugh, really laugh, the sound startling in his own ears. But that peace didn't last. Near noon, a heavy knock rattled the door. Arthur's chest clenched. He cracked it open and found Sheriff Dalton standing there, tall as the pines, scarf frosted, his cruiser idling at the bottom of the drive. "Morning, Arthur," Dalton said evenly. "Got a call about unusual tracks near your place. Some folks nervous about a bobcat hanging around." Arthur steadied his voice. "Plenty of wildlife up here. Nothing new." Dalton's eyes drifted past him, toward the warmth of the cabin. "Mind if I take a quick look around? Just to ease people's worries?" For a heartbeat, Arthur considered lying outright. But then, behind him, a sound broke the air. Willow's chirrup, sharp and unmistakable. Lucy answered with a low rumble, as if scolding her. Dalton's brow arched. That didn't sound like Lucy. Arthur stepped out, pulling the door closed behind him, forcing a smile. "She's got a strange voice these days. Age'll do that." The sheriff studied him. Years of friendship weighed in the silence. Fishing trips, late-night rescue calls, funerals attended side by side. At last, Dalton tugged his scarf down. "Arthur, if you're keeping something wild in there, You're playing a dangerous hand. For you, for the neighbors, for the animal. Arthur held his ground. I've buried too many friends to let fear make me cruel. Whatever you think you heard, you didn't. Dalton sighed, the kind that fogs the air with more than breath. I'll give you time, but if more calls come in, my hands are tied. He tipped his hat and turned, boots crunching back through the snow. Arthur shut the door and sagged against it, pulse pounding. Willow darted out from behind the chair, eyes wide. Lucy rubbed against Arthur's leg as if to anchor him. He crouched, brushing a hand down Willow's back. We just bought ourselves a little time, girl. But sooner or later, someone's gonna push harder. Willow blinked, uncomprehending, then nestled closer. For Arthur, the message was clear enough. The first real test had come, and though his lies had held, for now, the next storm would not be so easy to weather. The days that followed moved like a slow-burning wick, each one shorter than the last, each night longer, darker. The valley's hush was no longer the quiet he had once loved. It was thick, watchful, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Arthur tried to keep his routine, splitting kindling, checking traps for nothing more than practice, brewing his morning coffee. But everything felt altered. Every sound on the wind seemed louder, every shadow heavier. Even the pine needles under the snow seemed to whisper. Inside, though, life bloomed in miniature. Willow's body had filled out. The ribs that once showed like fragile sticks now curved strong beneath her fur. She leapt higher each day, small paws reaching for the back of the sofa, amber eyes catching sparks of the fire. Lucy tolerated her with an old queen's patience, though sometimes Arthur caught her studying Willow with a gaze that mixed pride and warning, like she knew she was raising a creature destined to return to a kingdom beyond these four walls. But peace was not theirs to keep. On the fourth evening, Arthur heard voices drifting up from the road. Not one, but several neighbors. He peered from behind the curtain and saw flashlights bobbing among the trees. Their beams probed the snow, sweeping low as if hunting for secrets. Arthur's pulse climbed. They were close enough that he could hear the scrape of boots, the crunch of ice. Willow stirred, ears pricking, body taut with instinct. Lucy rose too, tail lashing once, twice. Arthur whispered nothing, only pressed a hand to the air, urging them still. The neighbors lingered, talking in clipped tones. He caught pieces of it. Tracks too near the houses. Dangerous if it's hungry. Might call in the warden again. Each word was a stone in his gut. The minutes stretched like hours before the voices faded back toward town. Only then did Arthur realize he'd been holding his breath. He sagged into the chair, face in his hands. The crackle of the stove loud as thunder in the aftermath. Willow crept onto his lap, tucking her head under his chin. Her heartbeat racing against his chest. He felt the wild in her, raw and trembling, yet she chose his warmth. Outside, the snow glowed pale under a waning moon, a stage set for dangers he could not control. Arthur closed his eyes, stroking her fur with slow, steady fingers. He knew the world beyond his porch would not let this fragile miracle last forever. And yet, as Lucy settled at his feet like a silent sentinel, he made a vow in the stillness of that winter night. Until the day the wild claimed her back, Willow would know nothing but shelter, nothing but care, nothing but love within these four wooden walls. Winter had a way of keeping men honest. Yet it was fire, not ice, that tested Arthur next. It began with a faint tang in the air, acrid and metallic, carried on a wind that curled through the chimney cracks. At first, he thought it was his own stove smoking, but when he stepped outside, the night sky throbbed faintly orange beyond the ridge. Pine trunks flickered in that alien glow, shadows rising and collapsing like giants at war. Arthur's breath caught. Fire. In January. An old farmer must have left brush burning. Now the mountain had stolen it, fed it into its lungs. Inside, Willow was restless, pacing the cabin's edge, body taut with something deeper than fear. Instinct. Lucy crouched low, ears pressed back, eyes narrowed against a danger she couldn't name but could feel in every nerve. Arthur moved quickly. He filled buckets from the barrel, lined them by the door, checked the axe handle for cracks. He laid out a wool blanket near the porch in case smoke thickened. His old body protested, but fear had a way of making him swift again. The flames didn't reach his clearing, not yet, but the sky burned brighter with each gust, and the forest spoke in crackles and sudden pops. Rabbits fled across the snow. He caught one in the lamplight, bounding desperate and silent. The world was moving, fleeing. And here he stood with two creatures who could not survive without him. Hours dragged, the cabin shuddering with each gust that carried sparks downwind. Willow pressed herself against Lucy's flank, trembling yet refusing to retreat to any corner. Her wild eyes stayed fixed on the horizon, as if something in the fire called to her blood. Arthur sat by the window, a rifle across his knees, though he knew bullets were no match for flame. His heart was steady but heavy, carrying the weight of choices. If the fire crossed the ridge, could he protect them both? Could he even protect himself? And yet, as the hours crawled toward dawn, the wind shifted. The orange glow thinned, guttered, faded into dull smoke. Snow began again, tiny flakes at first, then thicker, as if the sky had decided mercy outweighed hunger. Arthur closed his eyes, his body trembling now that the danger had passed. When he opened them, Willow was climbing onto his lap, claws snagging clumsily at his shirt, her face pressed hard against his chest. Lucy leapt onto the arm of the chair, curling into the crook of his shoulder like she had done when grief was still raw in the house. The fire on the ridge had retreated, leaving black scars Arthur would see come spring. But inside his cabin, where two hearts beat against his own, something fierce and fragile had survived. He knew the world outside would not stop testing them, but for this night, he let himself believe that warmth and shelter could still and stronger than flame. Snow came heavy after the fire, thick veils that erased the blackened ridge and muffled every sound. For a while the valley seemed cleansed, as if winter wanted to hide the wound beneath its white hand. But Arthur felt the change inside himself. The fire had burned away more than trees. It had stripped him of the illusion that time was endless. Willow grew restless in those days, stronger, quicker. Her paws carried her in bounding arcs across the cabin. Her tail twitching with a wild rhythm Lucy no longer tried to restrain. At times she would press her nose against the window, body tense, ears flicking at noises Arthur could not hear. The forest was calling. He felt it as surely as he felt the ache in his knees every morning, and still he kept her hidden. Each trip into town, each wave to a neighbor, carried a stone of guilt. Their voices lingered in his memory. Dangerous if it's hungry, might call the warden. Secrets pressed against his chest until even sleep became shallow, haunted by the imagined knock at his door. Yet the cabin itself became something different, no longer just walls and wood. It was a fragile cathedral where three lives intersected. He would wake at night and see Lucy curled tight against Willow, their breathing perfectly matched, as if the wild and the tame had found a single rhythm. Sometimes he reached to cover them with the old quilt, and the sight of them together sent a pang so sharp it felt like both blessing and wound. One afternoon, while chopping wood, Arthur spotted fresh tracks at the edge of the trees, larger than Willow's, more deliberate. His breath stilled. The mother, perhaps, searching still. He followed them with his eyes until they vanished into shadow, the silence deeper than before. The knowledge pressed hard. The wild had not forgotten what belonged to it. That evening, as snow sifted down like ash, Arthur sat at the table with his untouched supper. The lamp flickered, casting shadows across the photographs on the wall. His wife's gentle smile. His younger self beside a trailhead sign. Lucy as a kitten curled in the crook of a flannel sleeve. Now Willow's image was missing, but already she belonged in every frame. Arthur closed his eyes. He understood now what it meant to carry both gift and burden. To keep her meant lying, risking, pushing against the grain of the world. To let her go meant surrendering the light she had sparked inside his long, quiet life. The weight of secrets pressed heavy, but so too did the warmth of a small body stretched across his boots, and the quiet watch of a cat who had shared his grief and now shared this impossible miracle. Snow whispered against the windows, steady, patient. The valley was waiting. Soon, Arthur knew, he would have to answer. The last storm of February arrived like a curtain, falling heavy and endless, burying the world in silence. Arthur sat by the window, watching snow swallow the trail until even the fence posts disappeared. The valley seemed erased, as though nothing beyond the cabin existed anymore. Inside, the fire burned steady. Willow lay stretched across the rug, no longer the fragile bundle he had first carried in. Her body lean, her paws sure, her spots bold against the glow. Lucy dozed nearby, whiskers twitching, her fur flecked silver with age. The two of them looked like mismatched pieces of one whole, stitched together by instinct and something deeper. Arthur felt the ache of inevitability. Each day, Willow grew less dependent, more restless, her gaze pulled to the window as though she could hear a voice carried only to her. The wild was not an intruder. It was her birthright, tugging at her bones. And Arthur, though his chest tightened at the thought, could not pretend forever. That afternoon, when the storm thinned to a soft drift, Arthur opened the back door. Cold swept in, sharp and biting. Willow stood, ears pricked, body low with anticipation. For a long moment she hesitated, then stepped out, paws sinking into snow, head lifted as if testing the air for memories. Arthur followed her with his eyes until the trees blurred gray against the storm's veil. He did not call out. He did not beg. He simply stood, hands braced on the frame, heart balanced between ache and pride. Lucy twined around his leg, steadying him, her warmth an anchor against the hollow space Willow left behind. Night fell slowly. Arthur stoked the stove, set his cup by the window, and listened. For hours there was only the wind, the hiss of snow against glass. Then, faint, almost imagined, a cry echoed through the trees, not lonely but alive. Arthur closed his eyes. It was enough. He understood now. Love was not in the keeping, but in the letting, in the choice to give shelter until strength returned, and then to release. As he sat back, Lucy curled in his lap, the cabin holding its fragile warmth. Arthur whispered into the silence, not to call her back, but as a promise that would outlast the storm. She belonged to the wild, but for a season, she belonged to us. And that, he realized, was more than enough. If you've ever shared a fleeting but unforgettable bond with an animal, I'd love to hear your story in the comments below. Take a moment to hold close the ones who've walked into your life, whether on 4 legs or 2. And if this journey touched your heart, subscribe for more stories of love, loss, and the wild miracles that find us.